The San Antonio Spurs were once a beacon of basketball excellence, the model franchise in the NBA. If you wanted to know what to do as a franchise, you'd simply ask what would the Spurs do and then do that. But you'll notice that I use the word once, because after 5 championships in 20 years, including 1 in 3 different decades, the Spurs today are a big pile of mediocrity with no clear long-term direction or future. So how did they go from consistently at the very top for over 20 years towards, at best, at the top of the bottom of the barrel? Well, it's actually quite simple. The man who helped build the Spurs empire ended up being the one to tear it down with his own hubris. That man, of course, is Gregg Popovich, the greatest coach of all time to many, including myself. However, as great as Pop is, rarely is he looked under a critical lens like so many other large figures in the history of the game, so I wanted to do that. Today, I will be presenting my character study and investigation of Gregg Popovich. Welcome to NBA Deep Dive. Okay, so in order to dive deep into Gregg Popovich and his flaws that resulted in the crumble of the Spurs empire, we have to go back, really far back in fact. Back in the 90s, the San Antonio Spurs hired a former assistant coach from the Warriors as their new head coach, not realizing they were setting in motion their franchise going from an essentially irrelevant team to one of the most acclaimed franchises in the sport for the next 20 years. Hold up, wait a minute, That's actually a typo, my bad. We have to go back to the 90s where Spurs executive Gregg Popovich fired the head coach of the team and then hired himself. Like, think about how crazy that is. Pop was both an executive and a coach as a rookie head coach. That just doesn't happen. Executive and head coach historically is a bad idea, by the way. Not that that has been the case of Popovich, it's just very abnormal for a rookie head coach to have that kind of power. And as for how Gregg let his team know he'd be the new coach, well, he fired the old one without telling them, and then got on the team bus as they were leaving for a road trip, and then he simply said, "I let go of Hill, I'll be your coach." And then he told the driver to head to the arena. This was after months of Gregg seeming to want that position. Bob Hill himself said that Gregg was clearly always wanting to be the head coach. This was a very weird start to a coaching career. Gregg's first year in San Antonio as a coach was a poor one, not from his own failures, but due to an injury to the team's aging superstar David Robinson. On top of this, the way Gregg asserted himself into the role was not all that well received. In fact, in the first home game with him as head coach, Spurs fans booed him in the introductions. Despite this, though, it was very clear that Gregg had the respect of his players, not necessarily because he earned it, but because he commanded it. Being that he was the general manager, if you didn't like what he was saying, well, he could just trade you. He had absolutely no issue asserting his power and making sure he got his way from the very beginning. This season was essentially a state of limbo, waiting for the next thing to happen and hoping for a high draft pick that could take the team to the next level, because while the Spurs had seen success to this point with Robinson at the helm, they'd only go as far as the Western Conference Finals. It was very clear that this team had a cap on it, and with their core going into their 30s, there was very much a need for a spark. That spark would come in the form of the #1 pick in the 1997 draft, where the Spurs would select one of the greatest players in the history of the game, bringing Tim Duncan and David Robinson together, forming the Twin Towers. A nickname that, well, didn't age well. But with this young player who is a superstar in the NBA from day one, Gregg's coaching prowess combined with David Robinson's talent meant the Spurs had a real championship window out of the gate. And while they wouldn't get it in 98, in 99 through the dominance of the Twin Towers, the Spurs brute forced their way through the Western Conference, beating the Kobe and Shaq Lakers that were more so the Shaq Lakers at that time, and the Rasheed Wallace, Jermaine O'Neal Blazers in the conference finals. They met the 8th seeded Knicks in the finals. Yes, you heard me right, the 8th seeded New York Knicks. And they swiftly took care of them as well, all in all losing just 2 games in total in the playoffs. This championship run established that Duncan, Pop, and the Spurs were here, and they weren't going anywhere. They proceeded to lose in the playoffs over the next 3 years, as no one was stopping the now Kobe and Shaq Lakers. In those 3 years, though, a few notable things happened. The team drafted Manu Ginobili and Tony Parker. Tim Duncan would win an MVP. Popovich would hire R.C. Buford as the general manager while remaining president of basketball operations, meaning that Popovich was still completely in control of every move that the team made. And the relationship between Pop and Duncan would continue to grow. A relationship that would be the foundation of the Spurs' success over the next 2 decades.
All he really cares about is being a good guy, living his life, doing the right thing. It kind of leaks over into basketball, which was his job for so long. He just wanted to do the best job he possibly could, but mostly to win.
It's quite interesting to hear Popovich actually talk about how he viewed Duncan. One thing that Pop often refers to is how much Duncan wanted to, quote, do a good job. It's pretty telling of their dynamic and really of both of them that Duncan viewed basketball that way and that Popovich admired him for viewing basketball that way. You'll understand why I find that really interesting a little bit later. 2003, though, was the year for the Spurs. Actually, shit, my bad. Another typo. I don't know how these keep getting in here. 2003, though, was the year for Tim Duncan. While you might look at this roster and see the names David Robinson, Tony Parker, and Manu Ginobili, Manu was a rookie, Parker was good but still just a 15-point-per-game scorer in his second year, and David was in the last year of his career at age 37, averaging 8 and 8. Duncan, on the other hand, averaged 23 points, 13 rebounds, 4 assists, and 3 blocks, and he led the team in everything besides for steals and assists. He was also still second in assists as a power forward. He was MVP, the Spurs won 60 games and made a championship run where Duncan averaged 25, 15, 5, and 3 on 53% shooting. He pretty much single-handedly beat the Kobe and Shaq Lakers in round 2 where Duncan averaged 28, 12, and 5 while slowing down Shaq on the other end, on top of him averaging 24, 17, 5, and 5 blocks in the finals, including a 21, 20, 10, and 8 performance in Game 6 that is argued to have been a legitimate quadruple-double that he was just not given the 2 blocks for. And as for his help on this run, offensively, Steven Jackson averaged an inefficient 13, and Tony Parker averaged an inefficient 15. That was pretty much it. Duncan wasn't always the flashiest and biggest stat sheet stuffer, but he was this year for damn sure. His 2003 run is wildly underappreciated and under-talked about. It is one of the most impressive individual runs by any player in league history. 2004, they would lose to the Lakers. 2005, they would win it all, this time with the trio of Timmy, Tony, and Manu completely coming together as a dominant big three. 2006, they would lose to the 60-win Dirk-led Mavs, and 2007, they would run through the West, losing just 4 games, and they would sweep a defenseless Cavaliers team who was basically just LeBron James and a bunch of future car salesmen. But then, we get a 7-year drought between them and the next championship. As for why they went through such a large drought, not getting even as far as the finals despite their personnel not really changing, well, there's no clear answer. This video is obviously me looking at the Spurs critically, but like, they really did not do much wrong besides not winning a series that they weren't like heavily favored in. Every loss in this 7-year stretch is justifiable to me. One thing that did become abundantly clear though was that for whatever reason, the formula was not working when it had worked in the past. Duncan was getting older, and the Spurs couldn't afford to keep repeating the same cycle, otherwise they'd just be wasting the rest of his career. So what was the solution? Well, the Spurs could not rely upon Duncan anymore to the extent that they had. The Spurs progressively made a huge shift in their offense, going away from just spamming Duncan post-ups and Tony Parker floaters to instead running a motion and pass-heavy offense. This spawned one of the most intricate and beautiful offenses in the history of basketball. Like, I was new to basketball in 2013 when this team came around, but even then I knew that this was something special. In 2013, with some new personnel that fit the system, the Spurs won 58 games and were the #1 offense in the league. With this team, they made it through the West, losing just 2 games and looking like a dominant force despite not having a superstar on the team anymore, with Duncan being older. However, the celebration of their first finals appearance in 6 years did not last long, because as good as the Spurs were, they were walking into a series as an underdog, because outside of a few outliers, teams just didn't win championships without superstars, especially when they were facing a team like the Big Three Miami Heat, who had 2 superstars and an all-star. That being said, the Spurs got the upper hand in this series, winning Game 5 to go up 3-2. Game 6 comes around and the Spurs have complete control until, well...
James catches, puts up the 3. Won't go. Rebound, Bosh. Back out to Allen. His three-pointer. Bang! Tie game with 5 seconds remaining.
Yeah, that wasn't ideal. What also wasn't ideal is that the offensive rebound that Chris Bosh got happened because Gregg Popovich decided to take Duncan off of the floor in favor of Boris Diaw. Pop inserted himself into a situation he had no business in, trying to make a 1 million IQ play when it was in fact a 0 IQ play. The Heat win in overtime, and then they eventually win Game 7. This loss was big for the team. This was a make or break moment for the Spurs empire. Either they got one more running it back, or this was the end. Well, it wasn't the end. 2014, the Spurs were very similar to the year prior. They once again get to the finals, once again face the Heat, but this time they win, and they do so convincingly. Winning in 5 games, with their 4 wins coming with an average deficit of 18 points. This was a team effort that was led by the team's young forward Kawhi Leonard, who played amazing defense on LeBron James and averaged 18 points on 75% true shooting. Fuck. I completely forgot to mention in the script there that the Spurs drafted Kawhi. I could have just put it back in retroactively instead of doing this cut, but actually there's no but. I should have done that. This Spurs team was a product of Gregg Popovich more so than Tim Duncan and any other individual player. 99 was Duncan and Robinson, 03 was all Tim Duncan, 2005 was a collective effort but still mostly Duncan, and 07 was a total team effort with the Big Three. But this year, Gregg was the biggest reason for their success, with his coaching being the reason this roster was so successful. Pretty much any other coach with this roster does not go half as far as they did, and Pop deserves all the credit in the world for that. And it was this series that, for me and for many other people, cemented Gregg Popovich as the greatest coach of all time. Yeah, as much slander as this video is going to have for Popovich, I still think he's the greatest coach of all time. But speaking of that slander, let's get to that. After 2014, Kawhi Leonard was established as the league's next rising star, which could not have been better timing for the Spurs, as Duncan was 38 years old. Kawhi averaged 16 and 7 the following season, making clear progress in his creating ability, and in the 2016 season, he fully broke out, averaging 21 points per game on very good efficiency. Also that year was the first year of LaMarcus Aldridge in San Antonio. LaMarcus Aldridge had left the Portland Trail Blazers in order to be the face of the franchise and to be more marketable, and in his first year, Kawhi Leonard became the face of the franchise, and who the fuck goes to San Antonio to be a marketable superstar? That's like going to Antarctica in the dead of winter to improve your tan, or going to Cleveland to fix your depression. Just completely illogical. But this new duo won a whopping 67 games this year, which was a franchise record, doing so in Duncan's last year as a Spur. Side note, we don't talk about how the 73-win Warriors and the 67-win Spurs happened in the same season in the same conference nearly enough. That's fucking wild. However, this team would lose to the OKC Thunder in the second round in 6 hard-fought games. Game 7 would be the last game of Duncan's career, meaning that Popovich would be without Duncan for the first time since he was a rookie head coach, which was 20 fucking years ago. This would be interesting. Duncan might not have been particularly great in his last few years, but he was always the leader on the floor and Pop's right-hand man. Some might say his bottom bitch, but I think that's a bit rude. So how did the Spurs do in their first year without Duncan? Well, they were a 60-win team again, and Kawhi was officially a superstar. The Spurs took care of business in 6 games in both of the first 2 rounds, and they would face the three-headed snake of the Warriors in the conference finals. Game 1 was going extremely well for the Spurs. They had full control over the game thanks to the effort of Kawhi Leonard, who had 26 points in just 24 minutes. However, the reason he played just 24 minutes was, well, this.
Leonard fires from the corner. Leonard goes down again. And he's in pain again in front of the Spurs bench. Again, that's what they call all the time when you get your feet into the landing space of the shooter. Taking a pounding here in the third quarter, one that was already sore.
Now there's quite a bit of debate surrounding this injury, whether it was dirty or not. It was. And whether or not the Spurs would have won if Kawhi did not get hurt. They wouldn't have. But that's not what's important here. What's important is that this injury would end up being essentially what caused the fall of the Spurs empire. People just didn't know that at the time. This injury set on a sequence of events that would lead to a very different future from what we all expected for the Spurs, Kawhi Leonard, and Gregg Popovich. But how? How could an injury that wasn't anybody's fault except for Zaza Pachulia's end up being what caused the fall of this empire? Well, it's actually not a long story. Kawhi Leonard injures his quad. He's set to return sometime in the following season. However, Kawhi and the Spurs seem to disagree on when that return should actually take place. After meeting with team doctors, Kawhi is cleared to play again, but he doesn't agree. He knows his body best and he doesn't feel he's ready, so he asks to get a second opinion from non-Spurs team doctors and stays away from the team. Kawhi played just 9 games in the 2017-18 regular season, where he could have looked worse, but he definitely didn't look his best. Kawhi, even after being cleared, refused to play. This caused a lot of stress around the organization and tensions rose as a result. Now, this is the part where Spurs fans start to blame Kawhi Leonard, but me personally, I was on his side then, and I obviously still am now. The dude knows his own body, and while the Spurs have a pretty good reputation in terms of taking care of their players' health, they also had a vested interest in him returning as the team was struggling quite a bit without him. Now, with this conflict going on internally, there was some stress and reason to be concerned. However, what came next would be a surprise to everyone. Kawhi said, "Enough is enough. Trade me." And as much as the Spurs tried to fight it and convince Kawhi to change his mind, it just didn't happen. Now, even coming off of an injury and on a 1-year deal, there was still plenty of interest around the league. There were offers on the table such as future and rising stars Brandon Ingram from the Lakers and Jaylen Brown from the Celtics, both deals involving first-round picks. The Lakers actually apparently offered a quote-unquote Godfather deal for Kawhi, which would have been perfect because Kawhi was actually specifically asking to go to the Lakers. However, Gregg, who remember was still completely in control of what the front office did, decided, you know what, Kawhi, I'm gonna be petty. I'm not sending you to sunny LA. I'm sending you to cold as shit Toronto. A whole other country. Hope you brought your passport, bitch. The Spurs got back DeMar DeRozan and Jakob Poeltl. The Raptors in the following season would go on to win the 2019 championship, with Kawhi having one of the greatest playoff runs in league history. Meanwhile, the Spurs were bounced out in the first round. Then in the offseason, Kawhi left the Raptors to sunny-ass California, the thing that he had desired to begin with. So being petty did not even work out for Popovich, because Kawhi got a championship and finals MVP and then still ended up in Los Angeles in a situation where he was able to pick the pieces to build around him to his liking. And then the Spurs, on the other end of things, got a shit deal. So that's the lesson there. Don't be petty. And now Kawhi is in LA with one of the best teams in the league, and the Spurs have missed the playoffs twice in a row with only a few young guys to give this team hope for the future, as Popovich seems to waste away the remaining years of his coaching prowess with a mediocre team that he assembled. I'm sorry. I don't know why this footage got cut in. Transition. So what went so wrong in San Antonio that going from one generational talent to another would result in the collapse of the empire that the franchise had built? Well, it's time to talk about Gregg Popovich. Ego is defined as a person's sense of self-esteem or self-importance. The ego is the other side of the coin of id, which focuses on the more animalistic parts of the brain, while ego is where the conscious mind lives. Everybody has an ego. It's not inherently a bad thing. However, what is a bad thing is an inflated ego. Inflated ego is a very large problem among athletes and people who work in sports in general, especially at the highest level, a level that Gregg Popovich has seen himself in over the last 2 decades. And if you don't believe me, here's an interview I think sums him up pretty damn well.
Okay, what do you want? I'm so tired of this.
What went wrong for you guys tonight?
What went wrong for us?
Coach, you started Danny Green basically on Kevin. Was that, I mean, did that work very well?
Did you watch the game?
Yes.
What do you think?
Didn't.
It didn't work very well. So we'll have Danny grow 4 or 5 inches by Monday night. Tell him to jump higher and move quicker. And we'll tell Kevin, don't be so good. Come on. Come on, you're getting paid. Ask something.
And please don't tell me that him smiling or laughing it off means that it was just a joke and it doesn't actually count. First of all, there's an element of truth in all jokes. That's what Popovich is actually thinking. He's just saying it out loud. But as someone who also does this move all the time because I too am an asshole, I can recognize it as you're just trying to cover for being an asshole. Hell, I honestly believe that the decision to put Diaw in over Duncan at the end of Game 6 in 2013 was his ego saying he knew better than the obvious. With the obvious being leaving one of the greatest defenders in league history on the floor in an important defensive moment. So Gregg has an inflated ego. It kind of comes with the territory. It's pretty natural and, again, understandable. What's not natural and not common is how not inflated Tim Duncan's ego was. Among the greatest players in league history, which Duncan absolutely is, there's quite a handful of inflated egos among them. Duncan is different. Throughout his career, Duncan took no issue doing whatever it took to win. You'd have a tough time telling pretty much any other player of Duncan's caliber to shoot the ball less and be more involved in passing, but Timmy, no issue. You need him to take a pay cut so we can add more depth? He wouldn't have a problem with that either. And this was perfect for a guy like Gregg Popovich because the problem with inflated egos, even if understandable, like if I was this fucking guy, I'd have a bit of an ego. How could you not? Is that when you take 2 big egos and you put them on the same team, that can create friction. That friction doesn't always have to boil over and affect the team on the floor, but it often can. Of course, the greatest example of this is Kobe and Shaq, 2 of the greatest players of all time and some of the biggest egos in league history. Now, these egos were managed to the point where they were still one of the most successful duos in the history of the league, but it eventually ended up boiling over. Looking at another all-time inflated ego, we we have Mr. Took It Personally himself, Michael Jeffrey Jordan. Once again, another guy under Phil Jackson, something we'll talk about a bit later, don't worry about it. It's often said how lucky Michael Jordan was to have a player like Scottie Pippen who fit with him so well. But to me, at least from an on-the-court perspective, I don't think that fit was necessarily seamless and perfect. Really, I think he would have been better paired with a big man who knew how to pass. However, that's not to say that Scottie Pippen wasn't a perfect pairing for Michael Jordan, because he was. Not for his on-court ability, but for his lack of ego. He wasn't completely without one by any means, just look at his reaction after The Last Dance. Or really, I guess most of what he said in the last, month or two. But Scottie never took issue with MJ being the guy, and he wouldn't challenge him in a way that would cause insurmountable damage. Pop and Duncan actually had a somewhat similar relationship to MJ and Scottie, the difference being, of course, that Pop is a coach. Now, you'd think under those circumstances that the coach would be the Scottie, but in terms of who was the dominant personality, Gregg was the MJ in this example. It was and is clear that Gregg Popovich was and is the leader of the team. His word is gospel, you don't question him. You don't challenge Gregg Popovich. He made sure of that from day one by asserting his power as a general manager, and Tim Duncan, being the personality that he was perfectly okay with that. Give Duncan a job and he'll do it without question and do it well, and Pop knows how to give the right player the right job. He has a reputation for getting a lot more out of players than most coaches can, and that's for good reason. Dude made Gary Neal a valuable part of a finals team, made Danny Green a damn near finals MVP. It's almost like a general commanding his infantry. Gregg Popovich is an amazing general, and Tim Duncan was an amazing soldier. However, you might have noticed something about that description. That doesn't sound like an NBA head coach. It sounds like a college coach. Or, I guess, a drill sergeant, not that there's much of a difference. With college basketball, it's essentially a cult around a figure that you don't question. You as a player are a step below the authority of the coach, even if you are among the best of the best in college. Zion Williamson could not question Coach K. That shit would get shut down real fast. That's the college coaching culture. The problem with that is that Popovich is quite literally the only other coach in the league who is like that and continues to be employed. No other coach over the last 20 years has had the identity and the success and failure based solely off of the back of the head coach. That's not to say that personalities like this haven't existed as coaches in the NBA. They just don't last long because the league's culture doesn't align with that. It's one of the many reasons why college coaches often do so poorly in the NBA position. A head coach in recent memory who had the same mentality as Gregg Popovich is Jim Boylan, who had his players essentially stage a mutiny against him within the first week of him coaching them. He obviously wasn't even a quarter of the brilliant basketball mind that Gregg Popovich is, despite all the room that he had in that giant fucking head. But the point is, his mentality, the way he approached coaching, was relatively similar to Gregg Popovich, and his style just didn't work in the NBA. It was incompatible with NBA culture. That type of coaching style is only sustainable in the NBA if you have the type of players who are fine falling in line in a more college player mindset. And that's pretty damn rare unless you try to cultivate that type of roster. So, this is why the Spurs often look for diamonds in the rough, players who are just looking for an opportunity or maybe are even a bit unsure of their place in the league. That's why we see the Spurs with so many foreign players, G-leaguers, and players ready to retire. Gregg has been quoted as saying that foreign-born players are much harder working and much less entitled than American players, but the reason he feels this way and the reason he likes those types of players is because the less entitled ones are a lot easier to control. Bosses tend to like to scream entitlement when they aren't getting their way. Guys who will do what their general says because they don't have anywhere else to go. That's not to say it's been entirely smooth sailing. There have been divergents who didn't stick around long as a result or were just made to fall in line with a bit of strong arming, but overall it was a pretty efficient system that would hide Pop's biggest weakness. But now enter Kawhi Leonard, the perfect successor to Tim Duncan, another quiet superstar who would fall in line with the culture cultivated by Gregg Popovich. How perfect. Well, as it turns out, no. not perfect. Kawhi Leonard isn't a very outspoken individual, nor one who showcases much emotion in really any context. One can only assume that when Kawhi Leonard got married, his vows were just the Wikipedia definition of what marriage is, followed by a monotone I do. However, we were wrong to think that that meant that he was without personality, without ambition, and especially without ego. To many, Kawhi was the perfect transitional piece to continue the Spurs' dominance. Tim retires, Kawhi fills his role, and Popovich continues to fill up the championship display case until the day he dies. But well, we wouldn't be talking right now if that's what had ended up happening. Kawhi Leonard asked to get a second opinion on his injury, which shouldn't have been a huge deal at all. Right? Well, turns out it was, because questioning the great Popovich and Spurs system, even to a minor degree, just simply won't stand. And based on his last 20 years as a coach, Gregg has no reason to think that declining this would result in much of anything. At this point, it was natural for him to have an unquestioned control. In the past, the perfect soldier Tim Duncan would not get out of line and question his general, so there is no reason to believe that that would be any different for Kawhi. However, I believe, and this is just speculation based on some context clues, so bear that in mind. I believe that when Kawhi asked to get this second opinion, and it was made out to be a bigger deal than it should have been, that was the moment for him where the questioning that he had already started to do of the franchise really boiled over. And that quickly led him onto the path that he is on today. Now, I imagine that Kawhi had already begun to question the Spurs. However, it was this that really sent him on a downward spiral, and it's what followed that really put the nail in the coffin.
Do I still feel like a part of the team or the group or anything, like the group text, or just try to make him feel like he's not just totally on the outside looking in?
Yeah, I mean, he's out there, he's with us, but you know, it's hard when you don't practice with the team. The bulk of the camaraderie and is pre-game, post-game, and half-times when you're going through adversity or some trouble, and he's not with us most of the time.
I've been through it. It was a rehab for me too for 8 months, you know, so same kind of injury. Mine was 100 times worse, but same kind of injury. And I trust my Spurs doctors. They've been with me, you know, my whole career. They know my body better than anybody, and so for me it was a no-brainer to do the surgery with them. So when I did my injury, 48 hours I was in surgery. I didn't take like 2 weeks and go through options and stuff like that. For me it was a no-brainer because I feel like we have the best medical team in the world.
The two players remaining from the Duncan era who had won 4 championships in that era, when asked about their superstar teammate who is the reason their team is successful in the first place, essentially shit talk and dismiss him, not taking their teammate's side, bashing him. And it was these interviews that would really give weight to the term, when there is smoke, there is fire. At this point, Kawhi was just completely disillusioned with the Spurs franchise and the great Gregg Popovich. He quickly came to the realization that this was no longer the place for him. So, that smoke became fire as he shocked the world and asked to be traded. And when I say shocked the world, make no mistake, that is not hyperbole. Kawhi asking for a trade was shocking. Yes, there was smoke, not an insignificant amount of it, but no one expected a fire quite like this. Because to this point, the Spurs and Popovich had over 20 years of an established empire that on the outside looking in appeared to be squeaky clean. If they lost, it was because the other team was better. If they failed, they would bounce back. If a player left, it was something wrong with that player, not the team. This was the model franchise that represented how to do things right at every turn. A player, and even superstar player, asking out isn't abnormal, especially in recent NBA history where it seems like there's a new superstar player on the block every other offseason. However, one asking out of San Antonio just didn't seem possible. And that's because people didn't realize just how inherently flawed the structure of the San Antonio Spurs really was. And yes, I did just say that, the Spurs structure was always inherently flawed, because it was always based around a system that had to be specifically cultivated around Gregg Popovich's ego, and that could not be sustained without very, very specific pieces. Gregg did a great job of making sure that he had the right pieces to win and to maintain that system, but at a certain point, stuff started to slip through the cracks. That something that slipped through the cracks was Kawhi Leonard. Gregg Popovich and his inflated ego does not work alongside another inflated ego. Popovich is incompatible with superstar players who have those inflated egos like him, which is most of those superstars, including Kawhi Leonard. Honestly, not just an inflated ego, really any ego or self-respect. The reason it took so long for us to realize this flaw is that Gregg found himself in the perfect position for his ego and style of coaching with San Antonio and with Tim Duncan. Gregg's biggest flaw is covered in its entirety by the position he had as a coach and executive and by the big fundamental, which is why it's particularly funny and annoying to me when people try and discredit Tim Duncan's accomplishment because he was coached by Gregg Popovich, because it is abundantly clear to me after the post-Duncan era that it was Pop who needed Duncan, not the other way around. At every turn since Duncan was drafted, Pop could tell this unbelievable talent what to do, and he would comply without hesitation. No matter how hard the task or ridiculous the command, Duncan always did his job. Like I said, Duncan was a good soldier and Pop a good general. So with this relationship, they won many battles together. However, that soldier couldn't just be replaced on a whim. The successor to the perfect soldier has to be yet another perfect soldier. And much to the dismay of Gregg Popovich, unfortunately for him, Kawhi wasn't the perfect soldier. He has ambitions. He wanted to be the face. He wanted to get his own damn credit for his own damn talent. He wanted to be recognized as a superstar, wanted ads and shoe deals, wanted what any superstar player does. And he wanted to be sure he was healthy before thrust out to battle again. Even that was too much. All of this wasn't compatible with Popovich's system. The general asked his soldier to fall in line like he had so many times before, like the soldier before him had time and time again. And this time he said no. And when Kawhi did that, the cracks started to form, and eventually the whole facade came crumbling down, and here we are today. You know, with time to sit and reflect upon this entire situation, it really makes you start to question the greatness of Gregg Popovich, just really how perfect the circumstances had to be around him to allow him to have the legacy that he does. And really, I just have to say something real quick, something they don't want me to say, something uncomfortable. Wait a minute. Why the fuck am I in the woods? Okay, as I was saying, I need to say something. Gregg Popovich and his greatness, at least in the terms of the heights of it, was benefited so significantly by the presence of Tim Duncan and the unique circumstances in his favor from day one that it's absurd that it's not the consensus that Gregg was lucky to have Tim Duncan, not the other way around. Due to his own ego, Gregg would have been his own worst enemy if he hadn't had such a perfect superstar for what he brought to the table. If Gregg had, let's say, Kobe as his superstar when he came to San Antonio, there's not a chance that he'd have the legacy that he does right now. It was through Duncan that Pop managed to hide his flaws and amplify his strengths. Gregg knew how to command an army, but he could not handle when somebody questioned his authority. Duncan was the perfect fit for that. Make no mistake, from an X's and O's standpoint and command of the locker room standpoint, there is not a coach in the history of the sport who outdoes Popovich. However, that's not the only part of the job as a coach. The management of ego is a big part as well, especially in the NBA when you're dealing with grown men with ambitions and money on the line, not a bunch of kids in college. Let's talk about the other coach commonly called the greatest coach of all time, the Zen master himself, Phil Jackson. Side note, some stuff came out about Phil Jackson while I was making this video. Turns out, dude's racist, but that doesn't impede him as a coach, or at least it didn't appear to. And that's also not relevant to this discussion. I just wanted to not say nice things about him before first saying saying, fuck Phil Jackson. Okay, back to the program. Phil didn't have an inflated ego, or at the very least, he didn't show one as a coach. He was most often acclaimed for his management of egos and big personalities, both with the 90s Bulls, because MJ is one of the most infamous egomaniacs in sports history, and of course, managing Kobe and Shaq. Now, you could say, well, he obviously mismanaged them, but honestly, based on looking at that relationship with the critical lens for years, the fact that he got 3 championships out of those two before they tore each other's heads off, that was a miracle and a half. If it was Phil Jackson and Kawhi when Kawhi asked for a second opinion on his injury, I would bet everything that I have ever loved or will love that that situation would have gone down drastically differently. And that's not to say that Phil Jackson is better than Gregg Popovich, because I don't think he was. He might have been better for this situation, but he also wouldn't hold a candle to Gregg's X's and O's game. There's not a chance in hell that Phil could have pulled off a run with the talent that Gregg had to his disposal in 2014. Even the brilliant triangle offense you could credit to Phil was much more the vision of Tex Winter than Phil himself. But at the same time, Gregg would not have worked with Kobe and Shaq at all. That would have been a disaster. The only way I could end up seeing him pull those two together is if they both hated him so much that they teamed up to get him canned. So what's the point of all this? Why the fuck am I in the woods right now? Well, I don't know the answer to that second question, but I can try and answer the first. If Gregg was hired by another team without control of the personnel decisions of that team, with another superstar with a more typical personality of a superstar, he wouldn't have stayed in the league for long. He needed the perfect launching point in order to find success. Otherwise, he would have been just another great basketball mind that just wasn't built for the NBA culture. He needed a superstar who would allow him to cultivate his own culture around his ego. Now, given those perfect circumstances, Gregg Popovich can take you extremely far. Just look at the 2014 run. It took incredible talent and incredibly perfect circumstances for something like that to happen. Gregg Popovich is not without talent, to say the least. I never want to give that kind of impression. In fact, I think Pop has pretty much every reason to be an egotistical tyrant. If you're gonna be like that, at least have the accolades and the talent to back up that behavior, like MJ or Kobe did, but this time with a coach. And it's not uncommon for players, and I'm sure coaches as well, to have as much talent as anybody and still have it fucked up either from their own shortcomings, like let's say an inflated ego that doesn't reflect their talent, or from poor circumstances early on. Just like there's players who are elevated by perfect circumstances and then prove useless by comparison under others, just like Pop would have, in my opinion. I genuinely think that if Pop did not have this perfect job, he would not have found real footing in the league, because his coaching style would otherwise be incompatible with the NBA culture. Now, if you're a Spurs and Gregg Popovich fan and you're wondering, what's the point of all of this? What does it matter? Why discredit someone for their accomplishments just because they had really good circumstances to allow their talent to accomplish those things? Well, first of all, I'd say, now you know how former Spurs players feel. But second, we as NBA fans love to play the context and what if game. If this player didn't have this happen, if this injury didn't happen, if this trade was different, why these circumstances actually invalidate this achievement. But we seldom have this conversation with coaches, and as a result, their place in the pantheon of NBA figures and legends remains shockingly secure in comparison to the players. And I say, if we're going to look at everything through a hypercritical lens, why do we stop at figures like Gregg Popovich? Why is he some unquestioned figure that can't be criticized, especially in the post-Duncan era? I don't really understand it. Another reason why is I felt it'd be fun to go down this rabbit hole and then end up in the woods for some reason and have my neighbors judge me. Ultimately, Gregg Popovich is a flawed individual with a brilliant basketball mind that was lucky enough to find himself in a situation where his flaws weren't apparent in a way that held him and the team back, and thus his brilliant mind could flourish without interruption. As talented as he is, he got lucky. Very lucky. And he would tell you that himself.
It's not a show of humility in any way, sense, or form. People who grew up with me know me. I would not be standing here if it wasn't for Tim Duncan. You know, I'd be in the Bud League, the Budweiser League, someplace in America, fat and still trying to play basketball or coach basketball. But he's why I'm standing. He's made livings for hundreds of us, staff and coaches over the years.
Duncan, being who he was, swept Gregg's biggest flaws under the rug. But when faced with a new situation he hadn't had to deal with in 2 decades as a head coach, those flaws could not help but show themselves. And now Pop sits with a mediocre roster as his remaining years dwindle away. Meanwhile, Kawhi got another chip, still ended up exactly where he wanted in Los Angeles, and Gregg has no one to blame but himself. It's honestly quite sad when you think about it. The previous unquestioned figure of basketball excellence tore down the very empire that he built. Well, this video ended up going in a direction that I did not anticipate. Originally, this video was supposed to be an overall look at the Spurs and how the empire came crashing down, but instead it really just turned into a character study of Gregg Popovich. Now, obviously, I ended up changing the formula in this one. Different shots, different editing, different settings. I drug my chair out into the woods for some reason. By the way, if you're a Spurs and or Gregg Popovich fan, please understand I'm not really trying to take anything away from his greatness. As I've said already, I still believe him to be the best coach of all time. I just think that every major figure in sports should be questioned to some extent or another, and Popovich really never is, so that's what this video was. I had a lot of fun with it, and I hope you did too. I look forward to evolving this deep dive series further, because this is just the beginning.